Sean is mic'd, but I'm not, so I'm going to lean over this. I'm Jack Stapleton, and I want to thank Maeve Clark from Iowa City Public Library for organizing tonight's session with Sean Strub. This is the fourth of 5 days of reflecting, really, on 30-plus years of medical care at our clinic at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics for HIV and people with HIV and AIDS. And we've had a really good week so far, and Sean came in last night and joined us at the movie. And I just want to give you a little background about Sean. He's an amazing guy, and he came from a very unusual place, Iowa City. He grew up in Iowa City, and he left really at the end of high school or towards the end of high school to the East Coast, to Washington, D.C., and then to New York City. And he's had an amazing career of activism and publishing, and he has a lot of direct mail fundraising for very important groups in the HIV epidemic, Gay Men's Health Crisis, which founded in 1982, and Sean worked in that group among a lot of political things. He's also the mayor of Milford, Pennsylvania. I mean, it's just amazing, and the people that he's gotten to know and run into and befriended is worth reading about, and you can do that. He has a memoir that's out front, and I'm not pushing this because I'm a book salesman, but I'm about a third to a quarter, or a little more than a quarter way through, and it takes me back because I started taking care of people with AIDS and HIV in the early '80s, and the stories and issues and emotions that really are raised by reading his book strike very true to me, and I think they're moving and tell a story that everyone should know about. So it's really been great to have Sean come all the way from New York City back to his home, and he's going to talk tonight about one of the things he's working on now that he's done a great job in Iowa about, which is trying to improve the laws related to HIV criminalization. So thank you, Sean, for coming.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Maeve. Thank you, Iowa City Public Library. I am a pro-library mayor in Little Milford, Pennsylvania. And the Iowa City Public Library was very important in my childhood. I went to Saturday morning story reading across the street here. So that was. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific topic, HIV criminalization, and I'm going to show a short film, talk a little bit more, and then try and get to Q&A as quickly as we can, because I generally find the question and answer session most interesting. HIV criminalization is the wrongful use of someone's HIV positive status in a criminal prosecution. About 2/3 of the states have laws that only apply to people with HIV. It's created sort of a viral underclass in the law, a different law just for people who have this virus. But in every state, prosecutors will over-prosecute. They'll heighten the charges simply because someone has HIV. So spitting at someone is not a very attractive behavior. It's appropriate for there to be some sort of sanction, right? Misdemeanor or whatever it is. But there's a man serving 35 years in Texas for spitting at someone because he was convicted of, I think it was attempted murder, or so I forget which it was. But so there's this proportionality gets lost in the law frequently when HIV comes into the case. This is, first of all, horrific in human rights terms. We have a member of our board of directors of the Sarah Project, Carrie Thomas, who was accused of not disclosing that he had HIV before having intimate contact with a woman he dated for some time. His doctor said he was undetectable throughout the relationship. He was not biologically really capable of transmitting the virus. The girlfriend said he always insisted on using a condom. And of course, there was no HIV transmission. He's about 9 years into a 30-year sentence. We can go on in Iowa It was, I think everybody got a 25-year sentence. It was an automatic 25-year sentence in Iowa. So these are really horrific human rights abuses. They erode the respect for the law when the law and the criminal justice system is applied in such an unjust manner. But they're also terrible, terrible public health policy. These statutes were passed, the HIV-specific statutes were passed in the mid to late 80s. And in many cases, they were passed without any controversy on a voice vote, sometimes supported by public health departments. The belief was that they would reduce HIV transmission. Pass a law that somebody has to disclose this, then people will modify their behavior. There is zero evidence showing that they have done anything to reduce HIV transmission. Literally zero evidence. There's not a single paper published that suggests that. I don't even know of anybody with an advanced degree in public health who suggests that these statutes are effective at reducing HIV transmission. And in fact, there's now a growing body of evidence showing they do the reverse, that they are making the epidemic worse. First and foremost, one can't be prosecuted if one doesn't know they have HIV. So they're a disincentive to get tested. You'll hear in some communities, take the test and risk arrest. And particularly when you're dealing with disenfranchised communities that already have some degree of suspicion based on past history with the criminal justice system or the public health system, they're feeling fine. Why take that test and risk having this legal liability? So they disincent people from getting tested, and we know that knowing one's HIV status is the first step towards really having effectively reducing HIV transmission in the community. They also erode trust between people and the public health system. The public health system needs to have the support and the trust of the public to be effective. And when you have a policing context to public health, people don't trust it as much. There's very good research showing that in states or in places where people with HIV know there is an HIV criminalization statute, they are less cooperative with public health. They're less cooperative with things like partner notification programs. There's also research showing that in states where gay men who know they have, and that there is an HIV criminalization statute in that state, they are more likely to engage in unprotected anal intercourse. They create an illusion of safety. So these are terrible for public health. They're making the epidemic worse, and largely these days they're only there because they continue to feed a stigma, a preconceived notion, a sense of wanting to punish people with HIV. So I want to show this film, and then we can talk a little more about it. But before I do, Jack, you very generously gave me some credit for changing the statute in Iowa, and I get this much credit, and this much goes to Tammy Hawk right here in the third row. But it's true. Tammy is from Nashua, Iowa. I like to say you grew up milking cows. And her husband died of AIDS 22 or 3 years ago? 23 years ago. And Tammy's been living with HIV. And about 10 years ago, she decided to become engaged as an advocate in Iowa and started going to Des Moines and knocking on those doors and organizing people in this room and the public health and medical community. So, and Iowa was the very first state to overturn its statute. Of the 2/3 of the states that have them, Iowa was first. The Des Moines Register was the first media outlet anywhere, including like in LGBT media that I know of, that editorialized in favor of reforming an HIV criminalization statute. I always, as an Iowan, I have to point that out because we know there's a remarkable progressive tradition in Iowa, and this is one more example. So about 10 or 12 years ago, I had been very ill. When combination therapy came out in the mid-90s, I weighed almost 40 pounds less than I weigh right now. For those of you who know what this means, my viral load was 3.3 million and my CD4 count was 1, but we like to say it was a very good one. I was covered in Kaposi sarcoma. About a third of the area of the left side of my face was covered in it. And I forget why I was pointing that out. Oh, so then, then when combination therapy came out, and I was fortunate to be around and to have access to it and responded well to it, and I took a few years off, and as I was getting better and I started thinking about getting re-engaged in HIV policy work, it was really this criminalization phenomenon that interested me because I saw it as the most extreme manifestation of stigma. When the government creates a different law for some part of society based on something people can't change, right? Whether it's their skin color, their gender, their sexual orientation, their genetic makeup, their physical ability or disability, we all think that's a pretty bad idea to create different laws for people. But here we're doing it for one group of society, people who carry a virus, some of whom are born with this virus. Yet in the HIV policy world, particularly at that time, the service providers and the advocacy groups were really focused on maintaining funding streams for the service providers and the clinics. It was so critical. And this sort of human rights issue kind of got neglected. And I spent a couple of years trying to engage a lot of the AIDS policy leadership in this issue. And I'd find some who were sympathetic, some who weren't, some who thought these statutes served a purpose. And I grew frustrated. And so ultimately, I started focusing on people who had actually been prosecuted to try and get them to speak up and to share their stories, because the power of storytelling is so incredible. And one of the first people I connected with was Nick Rhodes here in Iowa, and then Robert Suttle in Louisiana, and Monique Moret in South Carolina. So they're the first three people of the thousands of people who've now gone through this, and this is a global phenomenon, the first three people who were willing to talk to a camera about what happened. Okay, we're all set. Thanks. Oh, wow.
I was trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong. A law, something is against the law, then it's telling society that that is unacceptable, that's bad behavior. And I think the severity of that punishment tells you how bad you are as a person. You're a Class B felon, lifetime sex offender. You are a very, very, very bad person. You did a very, very, very bad thing. And so that's just, programmed into you, and, you go through the correctional system and everyone's telling you the same thing, and you're just like, I'm a very bad person, very bad person.
Today in court, Rouse was charged with another count of first-degree assault. The special statute covers passing on AIDS or poisoning someone with a destructive substance.
The prosecutor asked that another charge, unlawful use of a harmful device, in this case Alan's HIV status, be added. That's a 15-year felony. The judge agreed.
They learned that Chambers is HIV positive. Fort Mill police upped the charge from simple assault to assault and battery with intent to kill.
More serious charges were added because the defendant is HIV positive.
Because the suspect has HIV, he's facing some unusually serious charges.
Authorities, though, still consider him a danger as long as he can infect others.
HIV, gay, sex, all wrapped into one. It's just like it's a gift on a platter. Whatever the facts are, whatever the science is, it does not matter.
I come home one day and you just kind of get a feel, someone's been in your apartment or your home. And I looked on the counter and I saw a document, which was a search warrant left by the sex crime detective. They showed up to arrest me, and they arrested me at work.
So me getting HIV, it was like a shock. It was just like, how did I get this? How did it hit the Howells house? How did it hit here? I'm a church girl. My dad's a pastor. He's still a pastor. So we grew up in church. Hallelujah, thank you, Jesus, all day long. Being a good wife, and I did the right thing, and because of an affair that happened in my marriage by my spouse at the time, that's how I got it. He looked at me just like a man who was, he looked at me just as if I was negative, just like I'm normal. How do I even disclose my status? How do I do this? How do I get those words out my mouth? HIV. I was afraid of how he was going to look at me. I was afraid that how he would judge me, and the only thing I could say is, you need to get a condom. I had so many thoughts going on my head when I was sitting in court. Like, what if I walk out and so many people walking around calling me the monster? What if I get labeled a sex offender? What if they take my kids away from me? If convicted, I was looking at 8 to 12 years. And
if convicted, then the sentence would be anywhere from 0 to 10 years.
The full 25 years.
The Attorney General is arguing Williams should be held indefinitely under a newly enacted civil confinement law.
New York State wants to find another way to keep him behind bars permanently.
I felt like I went out and killed a whole bunch of people. They made me feel like that.
I mean, one thing I always told myself, and I've shared with others, that I would never end up at a police station. I would never go to jail, because I felt like I was always a law-abiding citizen. My mother had me at a very young age. 12 when she conceived me, and 13 when she had me. Yeah. So I always used to say that I'm before my time, because she had me so young. So I was a straight A student growing up, and just, very successful. But here, the very thing that I said would never happen to me, or that I would find myself in, is the very thing that was happening to me.
I had to register as a sex offender every 3 months, versus certain pedophiles and other, sexual crimes, it's like 6 months. I mean, I was like very dangerous in their eyes. Couldn't be around minors without being supervised by their parents. To wear a GPS ankle bracelet and be monitored 24 hours a day. No alcohol in the house, I could not drink, I had to be home by midnight, I couldn't watch pornography at all. They could ask me to bring my computer in at any time to interrogate it. I couldn't be on any social networking, not even Facebook. That's where pictures of my nieces and nephews are. I had to go through all these psychological tests to take some phallometric assessment test to see what really stimulates me sexually, which I think has something to do with putting a device on my penis. Polygraph tests. Every 6 months for the rest of my life, you're going to hook me up to this machine. You're going to ask me these same inane questions. I can't live like that, and I can't live under that probation system that is so suffocating and, just cruel.
On Fox, a warning from a woman infected with
the arrest of an HIV-positive prostitute in St. Louis
tonight about
for
this
hiding his HIV-positive status at swinger parties. The man called the HIV predator will make his
so-called HIV predator, someone with the intent to kill.
Why they are releasing her picture, calling him a
History.
threat to society.
The media, the military courts, whatever, they could call me whatever they wanted to call me, but I knew I wasn't those names that they were calling me. I just was a human being trying to, just wanted to fit in, just wanted to be loved, but it seemed like that 3-letter word, HIV, just had me stuck. I didn't realize the stigma on HIV and AIDS until I was diagnosed. Many people not wanting to go get tested, because they're afraid that if tested positive, if they had unprotected sex with someone and someone tries to get them in trouble.
Him reacting, the way he reacted is the way that is the reason why most people are afraid to disclose, because of the fear and because of the stigma that comes from it.
HIV criminalization needs to be changed.
My stepfather is a promise-keeping Baptist. He is salt of the earth and veterinarian, small town, and I told him this stuff, and he's just like, that is horse shit.
But what I've done since then is just devoted myself to advocacy, to volunteering, to getting involved and learning more about HIV and AIDS, and with hopes that that could open a door for me, because obviously this is my life now.
There you go. Thank you. Okay, so that's a little bit dated now, as I haven't watched it in a little while. We need to do a new one, Tammy. It was before we started the Saro project, which well, I should give you a quick update on the three folks in the film. Nick Rhodes, Iowan, I had coffee with this afternoon. He's living here in Iowa City. Some of you may have known Dan Johnston, who was a really legendary Iowa civil rights lawyer from Des Moines, who in 1968 won a very important Supreme Court case called Tinker versus the Des Moines School Board that established the right of students to non-disruptive political expression in school. Dan had retired and moved back to Iowa and took on Nick's case, and then an appeal was joined with Lambda, and the Iowa Supreme Court overturned his conviction. Robert Suttle ended up, I met Robert, is pretty extraordinary as well. My partner and I were on a 5,000-mile road trip and just kind of taking a break, and it was really at a time when I was getting frustrated, not feeling like I was getting traction on this issue. And the phone rings in the car. It's this real southern drawl saying, I just read something you wrote. He found my phone number. He said, I think that's what happened to me, this HIV criminalization thing. And he was saying he'd just gotten out of prison. And then I realized when he said just, it was like the day before. And he'd gone to his grandmother's house. And his grandfather was a minister who always said that your misery is your ministry. And he knew what his misery was, so he wanted to look into that and see if he could find a way to be of service in that. And as we were chatting, he said he had some background working in the courts. He could do legal research, whatever. And I said, well, where are you? And he said, I'm in Shreveport, Louisiana. And Javi and I were about half an hour away. And so then Robert started the Saro Project with me, which is a network of people living with HIV, fighting criminalization and organizing people with HIV into networks to speak with collective voices and to participate in the decision-making that affects our lives. Monique just adopted another child, a beautiful young woman. She's living in South Carolina and doing very, very well. I think a couple of her boys are out of high school now, maybe? One is, yeah. These, I have to say, are easy cases, right? HIV wasn't transmitted. It was just about HIV. They weren't in the context of some other criminal charges or some other criminalization happening around that. But they were personal stories that captured people's attention and really helped mobilize a movement that is now global. The Saro Project, which Tammy and I are with, Iowa was the first state. Tammy is our lead state organizer. We've now changed the statute. It's a big we. There are a lot of people involved, a lot of organizations in Colorado, in California, in Michigan, in North Carolina, but we did that through public health regs. What am I missing? We've got bills pending in Indiana and Florida and Missouri, soon in Idaho maybe, or no, not until next year. But anyway, there's advocacy underway in about a dozen states that are really efforts that we try and center people living with HIV and communities of color that are most affected by the epidemic, and then bring in public health, bring in political leadership, bring in community and civic leadership, and I think Tammy will agree with me, and it's been very satisfying work to see it grow. So with that, I want to open it up to questions, either about this specifically, or anything in my book, or Saturday morning reading things at the library, whatever you'd like. Okay. Somebody must have a question. Yes?
So, as you know, we get a lot of presidential candidates here in Iowa, and I like that we can talk to them and ask questions.
I was going to make an announcement. No.
In your spare time? What do you recommend the top questions we should be asking?
Oh, that's, you know what? The person creating the survey for the presidential candidates is sitting right in front of you. Working with a number of organizations to actually create a survey to get the candidates and talk about how they are going to address the epidemic. There are so many aspects to this, from the PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, that's global, to prevention strategies. You know, we've had a move that, in my opinion, is focused too much on biomedical prevention and not enough on looking at behavioral-based prevention and the circumstances in people's lives that put them at risk of HIV. So there's some kind of like philosophical approaches. A lot of it is how closely tied their administrations will be to the pharmaceutical industry, you know, particularly Gilead Corporation, which is, you know, I would say probably the single most powerful influence on epidemic policy in the United States, as well as research and prevention and everything. So, so a lot of it goes to sort of basic philosophies of them as candidates and how they view the healthcare system. So, yes.
Could you speak on your experience in ACT UP?
Sure, sure. So the question is to speak about my experience in ACT UP. ACT UP was very important to me. I think it helped save my life. It was an advocacy effort that began in 1987, is sort of best known for the fantastic theatrical demonstrations that we had. The prologue of my book is seen from inside St. Patrick's Cathedral when we had a protest there that was a very important protest. And, you know, ACT UP was as much group therapy as it was political action. We gathered in New York. There eventually were chapters all over the world, but where it started in New York, we gathered every Monday night in a big room at the Lesbian Gay Community Services Center on West 13th Street. The room was not air conditioned. Sometimes there were several hundred people in the room. So it was hot and sweaty and sexy, which was part of its appeal. It's been noted that ACT UP has a remarkable sort of similarity in form to the Catholic Church. We met once a week on the same time, the same day. We had our own set of customs and rituals and chants. We had a way we began our meetings and closed our meetings. We were very passionate about what we believed. And of course, you know, both were led by a man at the front of the room in a dress. But there's also a broader way to look at ACT UP, that we can look back, you know, years later, and there still is ACT UP. ACT UP's doing, you know, important work. And the two things I would say is that the advocacy that preceded ACT UP in some ways was I think, more radical and more important. And I don't mean that to diminish ACT UP, because without ACT UP, I don't think I'd be alive. But the advocacy that preceded that started when the first people with AIDS in early 1982 went public, and it was a handful. Bobby Campbell and Dan Turner in San Francisco, Michael Callan and Artie Felsen and Richard Berkowitz in New York. They found each other. You know, at that time, there wasn't any such thing as AIDS activism. The only people doing anything was sort of within the context of the then just emerging gay and lesbian political reform movement. A dozen guys, it was all men, with AIDS gathered in June of 1983 at the 5th Annual National Gay and Lesbian Health Conference, which was held in Denver. And it was the first time they met each other. None of them had ever been in a room with so many other people who also had AIDS. And they got in a room where there was nobody else in the room except people with AIDS, where the conversation becomes different. And they talked about what was happening in their respective communities. They debated the language. I think it was the San Franciscans who were very anti-use of the word victim. And they proposed people first language with people with AIDS. And they wrote a manifesto called the Denver Principles. that outlines a series of rights and responsibilities of people living with HIV and those who care for them. And in that, it begins with taking control of the language. We reject the label victim as it implies, passivity and defeat. We're only occasionally patients. We are people with AIDS. And it asserts a whole series of things: the right to be on the boards of directors of provider organizations and to have a seat at the table and be respected and treated holistically and so on. And that was what the beginning of the People with AIDS self-empowerment movement, where we were focused on each other. The government was letting us die. We know now from the transcripts from the Domestic Policy Council, Reagan's Domestic Policy Council, that it was a conscious decision to let us die, let nature take its course. It was treated like nature sort of cleaning house, and they would just sort of have this sort of benign neglect. And we weren't looking to them for that, and it was all happening so quickly. People were getting diagnosed, months or weeks or sometimes days before they died. So we were caring for each other. We were sharing everything we learned about dealing with symptoms or fevers or whatever was going on. Is this related to it? Is this not? We didn't know who really had it or not. It was before there was a test, before the virus was isolated. So every red spot, every headache, you were terrified around. And then we created, coming out of this Denver Principles, a document in June of 1983, we created a parallel healthcare service delivery structure, the hundreds of AIDS service organizations around the country, because the existing healthcare system was not suited to care for us. It was highly stigmatized, as all of society was. It was frightened, and we knew more about what was going on with this disease than the vast majority of doctors who had patients with it. So we created all these organizations to provide care and services. We created buyers clubs, as there were different treatments and experimental things ranging from pharmaceutical products to things like AL-721, which I still think was helpful. That we worked together and created groups to buy or import or manufacture these products that the FDA had not approved or would not approve. We created a system of community-based clinical trials. So research was over here. Clinicians who were actually treating us were over here. So we created organizations to organize these physicians to collect data at that immediate grassroots sort of frontline level. We created our own media. That was the movement that preceded ACT UP and that has actually been in a real revival in recent years. ACT UP happened, and I say this sort of carefully and with respect for my ACT UP colleagues, but looking back on it, there are two important things that I think are really three important things to remember. One, we absolutely expedited access to treatment and saved millions of lives. There's no question about that. But it's also important to understand that a lot of what ACT UP was the result of enough middle and upper middle class gay white men realizing this government was perfectly willing to let them die. And while they may or may not have suffered some degree of discrimination or disenfranchisement because they're gay, their gender and their skin color gave them such privilege. This was a shock to them that the government could be so callous. But to others, to communities of color, to women, whatever, who had long dealt with the government treating them in an inferior way, it wasn't quite as surprising. HIV/AIDS activism had to kind of take a place within the context of other advocacy efforts and priorities within those communities. For most gay white men, it was a singular challenge, and they were angry. I say they, we were angry. We couldn't believe it. So we stomped our feet and our fist on the table and had this sort of temper tantrum of these demonstrations say, pay attention to us, look at this is important. And to an extent, because we were from a class of society that had relative privilege, we did get attention We did get and then ACT UP became a much broader and diverse movement throughout the arts and humanities and everything. It wasn't just about the political action. But so I think it's important to see that in that context. And I think looking at the early years of the epidemic, the self-empowerment movement is so critical. We will not end the epidemic until we embody those principles, which were not original. They were really a codification of principles from the women's health movement that grew out of the 60s and the 70s. But what was remarkable about it was the first time in the history of humanity when a group of people who shared a disease, who shared an illness, got together and organized their right to a collective voice. And in that sense, it was sort of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution and Magna Carta all rolled into one for people organizing around the health conditions that were defining, ending, affecting, impacting their lives. And when at that conference they wrote this manifesto and they went back to the main conference hall and took the stage and read it,